Elements of art, the principles of design. So this will be the last section we'll look at with our elements of art section. The principles of design are basically how an artwork is arranged using the visual elements. So two words at the top here we'll see a lot in terms of design are composition and the word design itself. With composition, we're basically talking about the organization of a work, how the work is organized. With the design, we're talking about that, but we're also talking about the process that we arrive to get there. And so design is the process and product of arranging visual elements. Okay, so again, it has that dual meaning here of both that process as well as that end result. Okay, and so the next four things that we'll look at in greater detail after this slide here is our principles of design. There's four major principles of design we'll go over here. The first one's balance and harmony, which is the achievement of equilibrium, producing a pleasing and consistent whole. The second principle of design here is emphasis and subordination, where we have areas of more visual interest complemented by areas of less visual interest. The third one is directional forces, which are paths for the eyes to follow that are used to influence how a viewer looks at a work of art. And then the last one is scale and proportion, where we are talking about the size, the shape, and dimensions of a work of art. So let's look at that first one there. Balance and harmony. Balance is all about creating an equilibrium between two opposing forces. These opposing forces, I should say, is basically what we call contrast. And so we want to create this equilibrium between these opposing forces into a harmonious whole. That is what we would consider an effective design. So, as I mentioned here, contrast, these opposing forces of dissimilar visual elements, are needed, even to make the simplest art element line. Your line that you draw, there has to be some contrast there between the background. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the line if it was, for instance, the same color. And so we need some type of contrast to create art. And so on the right there, we see the yin and the yang symbol, and that's a good example of this because we have the contrasts of black and white. And it is a simple shape. We have a circle, we have this black shape, and then we have the reverse of the black shape in that circle, which is the white shape. Okay, and so that's where our contrast is. Now, if we look at the way the artist kind of resolves creating a harmony out of this, you'll see that part of that dark section, that little circle, is brought into the light section, and part of that light dominant section at the bottom is brought into the black section that is dominant. And so that little repetition, in this case the dots here, of those two opposing forces of dark and light, creates this type of harmony that we see with that particular design. So that's a very good, simple example of how this can be achieved. Okay, if we move on in a clockwise fashion, we see a picture underneath there. This picture is by Jacob Lawrence, and if we look at this picture, we see a lot of different shapes and different colors, and it's very flat. So shapes and colors are basically what is making this image up. And one way we see contrast being resolved, because we have a lot more here that's contrasting other than just two colors. We have several different colors and several different shapes. And so one thing that is utilized here is repetition. Repetition is a very good way to create a sense of harmony. It's similar to music. When we create a harmony or we create a chorus, you're repeating certain notes. And so we're doing the same thing here with art. In this case, he's repeating the browns, he's repeating the blacks, he's repeating the blues, the darker blues on the lighter blue background. Same thing with the reds. And so all of these are being repeated throughout the composition. So while we have a lot of different elements and a lot of different colors, it creates balance through that type of repetition. Okay, another way of repeating something, because repeating something does create a rhythm, is through that example on the bottom left, how we have really, in this case, shape is being repeated. Specifically the square and the rectangle that is repeated throughout the composition. It gives the composition a lot of balance because of that. We see that rectangular rectangular square motif used in the floor. We also see it in the windows are broken up into squares and rectangles as well. The ceiling, we see a lot of rectangles, and on the back wall above the fireplace we see a picture with this square rectangle type of shape, as well as what appears to be maybe a map or something that is hanging on the back wall there. And so again, throughout this whole composition we see that repetition of just a simple rectangular shape and how much unity it actually gives this composition here. Okay, so that's one type of thing that we will see create this sense of balance and harmony, this type of repetition, rhythm that we see. Another example of balance that we see is through symmetry. There are basically two types of symmetrical balance. There is symmetrical balance, we see on the left, and then there is asymmetrical balance here on the right. With the symmetrical balance, it's pretty simple, that whatever you see on one side of the composition, you will see on the other side of the composition. It's almost like a mirror image if we folded this construction down the middle. By the way, that picture that is displaying symmetrical balance, this is an example of the artist Damon Hirst, who's an artist working today, who is very successful. And those are basically like moths and butterflies that are actually pinned against a black background. And so it has this kind of stained glass window effect to it, but it's actually examples of like I said, moths and butterflies that have been pinned to a background there. Okay, so that's symmetrical balance. Now, most artwork is going to be asymmetrical in nature. And so the image on the right is an example of that. But if we look on the right side and we look on the left side, it doesn't match up exactly as far as what would be on the other side. And so if we see, as we move towards the background, we see most of the ships are there on the right side. And so to kind of compensate for that visual weight that we see with the ships and that directional force that the ships are getting at towards the background, we see more of the land area on the left side, that it goes higher up on the picture plane than the land mass on the right side. And so that's a way of counteracting those forces of the objects that we see within the composition. Another example of this balance is how the writing there at the top right is complemented by the writing that we see repeated on the bottom left, and that one on one side and the other one on the bottom of the other side is another example of asymmetrical balance here. Okay, so this is symmetrical balance, another way that we would see the principle of balance and harmony being used in art. Our next principle of design is called emphasis and subordination. Okay. With art, you're going to have some areas that have a greater visual interest and some areas that have less visual interest. Okay. The areas of greater visual interest are emphasis, and subordination are the areas that have less visual interest. So these are complementary. You can't really have one without the other. If everything was emphasized, then essentially nothing would be emphasized, because you can't emphasize everything. You have to have some areas that are subordinate. So a good rule of thumb for this next term that we see on the bottom, focal point. A focal point is basically the principal area or areas of interest within a composition. Those are the areas that are being emphasized. And a good rule of thumb is basically what you notice first within a composition. That is the focal point. That is the areas that are emphasized. And so if we look on the bottom left there, we see the painting by the Impressionist Claude Monet. And we see here in this composition, if we take a look at that composition down there, most of the time people will be drawn to the rising sun and its reflection, as well as the boats in the foreground. Those are generally our two focal points here. And so artists can use some principles of design to create other principles of design. For instance, the reason why that sun is something we look at is because of the contrast, which is something we see used in balance and harmony as well. And so if we see that contrast, it's a contrast between colors. We have orange, which is a very warm, very intense color, versus blue. And then most of the area surrounding it is kind of mixed in to where the color isn't as intense as that sun. So that's why that sun really stands out. It's because of its intensity. On the other hand, the boat there in the foreground really stands out because of value, that it's darker and the areas surrounding it are lighter. And so through either temperature or value contrast here, the artist is creating areas of emphasis. If we look on the top right here, we see a composition. And this is a good example as far as looking at some areas that have more of a visual interest and others that have less. For instance, most of the time we're going to be drawn to the figures in the foreground, but we might not even notice at first the figure there in the shadow in the foreground. There's a man all the way to the right that appears to be writing something down, and he is in shadow. His whole body is in shadow except for his back and his foot and leg there. And so that's an example of how he's really dropping out of the composition. He's really being a supporting mechanism for the areas that you will probably tend to notice more often, which are the other figures in the foreground, especially with that bright triad of yellow, red, and blue there. Okay, and so the architecture in this example is another area that we see being more subordinate to those figures in the foreground. And so, you know, where things are drawn sometimes, like in the front center, that's a good area to have emphasis just because of the placement, contrast like we mentioned, even directional forces we'll see later. All of these are ways that we can create emphasis, and of course we complementarily have subordination along with that. Okay, so here we see directional forces. And directional forces are basically the paths that our eyes follow. A lot of times this will be by an implied line. For instance, if we look on the left, that's an example of a painting by Edgar Degas. And so if we look at what is being featured here, we will see these horses will generally be what stands out. If we kind of go back to the last section, we look at what's being emphasized there. These horses are usually what our eyes will be drawn to because of the contrast between their color and the color of the background, as well as them being the most easily seen objects that are in the foreground. But if we notice what they do, they go from being large on the right to being smaller and smaller as we move to the left, and so that sends our eyes to the left. And it's a way of actually balancing the composition asymmetrically as well, because of all of the weight visually on the right. The fact that this line here is implying a line towards the left is something that really balances out the composition. So that strong directional force is like I mentioned, creating more of a sense of balance than otherwise we would have. Okay, so we have some directional forces with the objects and the horses on the one on the left. And if we look at the famous example of Van Gogh on the right, the Starry Night, we can see that here he's using directional forces really to send us throughout the composition, that our eyes are drawn by these flowing linear type of brush strokes. They're really sending our eyes throughout the whole composition, so it's really creating a sense of unity within the composition because it's all done with these really brash linear brush strokes. And so it really has a unifying effect, these brush strokes that he's using. And like I said, it sends our eyes equally throughout the composition, especially through that sky there. Okay, so this is an example of how directional forces can be used. Okay, our last example here is scale and proportion, where we have the size, the shape, the dimensions of things, and how that might affect the artwork. Okay, the first thing we're going to look at is the term format. Format is the shape or the dimensions of a work of art. Okay, and so this is important in terms of design because what you will have to do to design something in a square format is going to be different than how you're going to have to balance something in a rectangular format, and so on. So these are some basic formats that we see. We could talk about formats and their shapes. For instance, the thing on the left there, the portrait of Van Gogh, his self-portrait, is done in a rectangular format. We have a rectangular portrait format like we have here, which is more vertical, and the longer, or I should say maybe the landscape format, is where the rectangle is longer than it is tall. Okay, the next shape would be the circular format, something we would see for a coin here, like this coin from the ancient Roman times. More of a square format, we see this Andy Warhol example of Marilyn Monroe featured here on the third from the left. And the last one is a logo, the Ford logo in this oval type of format. So all of these would be different types of formats. You could also talk about formats in terms of their dimensions. You know, for instance, 20 by 16 is a popular format as far as 20 inches by 16 inches. That would be a rectangular format. You know, maybe a square format might be 2 inches by 2 inches. It might be 4 feet by 4 feet. You know, the dimensions would be different, but the shape in that case would be the same. So you can use dimensions or shape really to describe what the format would look like. Okay, the next thing is scale. Scale is the size relationship of one object to another. Okay, and so we would use ourselves as the constant reference here as far as the scale. And so we basically have small scale and large scale in reference to our own bodies. And so the picture on the left would be an example of a sculpture using small scale. The sculpture on the right would be an example of using large scale. And there can be certain strengths to each of these. For instance, the one on the left is actually done out of a pencil. That the elephants you see marching out and the trees there are the lead. And that has been whittled down, you know, that small to create those elephants kind of marching away from those trees. Whereas some of the top of the tree is where some of the wood surrounding that graphite and that pencil would have been left. And of course the bottom section that they're walking on is remnants from that wood there that held that pencil lead there too. And so small scale can be used to some advantages like this. You can see this is just kind of amazing actually in the size that was created. It can also be more intimate because you really have to zoom into something small scale. You have to kind of almost invade its space. Large scale, on the other hand, can have a different impact. If we look at the sculpture on the right, we see this sculpture is basically put out in the park in the middle of a city. And it shows these bowling pins being kind of mowed over by this bowling ball here. And so if we look at it, it's kind of, you know, this dynamic looking sculpture because of the angles and the directional forces that it's showing there. And it's an example of how scale can have a big influence on us because we see how large it is in comparison with those cars, and we can kind of put ourselves in that place and see how large scale it would be in comparison with a normal human being. And so it can appear really kind of monumental. With something large scale, it can be you know, kind of hard to ignore, and so it can really make you forced to take notice of it in a way that maybe something small scale wouldn't. And so each of these scales, you know, small scale, large scale, have, like I said, there's strengths to them. And the last thing is proportion. Proportion is size relationship of parts to a whole. Okay, and so we see on the top right there Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbook. This is an example of one of the pages from his sketchbook, and it's called The Vitruvian Man is the name of it. And he's working on trying to get the proportions of the human body accurately drawn within a square and within a circle, which is a little bit of a problem he was working on that he figured out pretty well here. Okay, now with artists, sometimes they might use proportion for, you know, more expressive content, like underneath the Vitruvian Man we see the famous painting of the Scream, and how the artist is elongating the proportions, especially that figure down at the bottom, for expressive purposes. that type of elongation, kind of stretching things out, has a different expressive content than if it was just accurately drawn. Kind of similar to that, that we'll actually see with the work of Michelangelo here, and on the left is an example of his work, the Pieta. He does an interesting thing in this Pieta, and he'll do this sometimes in a sculpture, that most of his sculpture will be very, very proportional, but occasionally he'll just kind of exaggerate things, like usually hands or feet. Sometimes he'll exaggerate to make them look kind of more strong or more established, whatever you might see. In this case, with the Pieta that we see, there are certain parts that are very proportional. For instance, if you look at the face of Mary, you were to look at the body of Jesus here laying on her lap, those proportions are very accurate. And indeed, we're kind of overwhelmed by how beautiful and how realistically they're rendered. What we don't notice that he's cleverly covering up is that if Mary here were to stand up, she would be enormous. For a full-grown man to comfortably reside in his mother's lap here, her legs would have to be, almost twice as long as they, would be. And so we don't notice that because, her size of her legs, as well as probably her arms here, we don't notice that type of elongation because it's being covered up with this beautiful drapery effect that we see here. And so we don't notice that if Mary were to actually stand up, she'd be huge in comparison. And so that's an example of an artist kind of cleverly hiding the proportion issues that he doesn't want us to pay attention to, and allowing us to look at the proportional issues that he does want us to look at. And so this would be a good example of how proportion is used for kind of expressive content, but also how balance and harmony is made by kind of finagling the proportions, as well as emphasis and subordination too here. So all of these are different principles of design we'll look at, and we'll have some exercises later on where we'll try to kind of work on that on ourselves as far as identifying them in different types of art. But for right now here, we're just kind of introducing these concepts, and so let's learn what each of these mean. All right, this is it.